This is part 2 of the lecture to accompany Chapter 16 in your textbook. I highly recommend you read Chapter 16 to help you more fully understand the information in this lecture. You may find helpful information in the textbook that I simply don't have time to address. You can pause, stop, and replay this lecture as many times as you wish. Okay, let's continue. All persuasive speeches are based on argument, and all arguments arise from questions. For instance, if you and a friend are watching a competition show like American Idol, you might argue over the question, who should win? There are 3 types of questions that give rise to persuasive speeches. Questions of fact, that argue whether something is true or false. Questions of value, where the argument lies in whether something is good or bad. And questions of policy, which argue about what course of action should be taken. Let's look at each of these. In a persuasive speech about a question of fact, you argue that your view of the facts is true. It's the same way a lawyer argues in court. They say, my client is innocent of the charges. Then they have to give evidence to prove that their view of the facts is the way the jury should look at the facts. In this example, the speaker wants to persuade the audience to believe that a large earthquake will very likely hit California in the next 10 years, as opposed to those who think that it probably won't happen. Most questions of fact are usually organized topically. In this case, the main points are reasons why the speaker believes the thesis to be correct. So this speaker has 3 major reasons why they believe that a quake is going to hit California in the next 10 years. Now, obviously, they have to find evidence to prove that each one of these reasons is indeed the case. Questions of value, however, require judgments based on a person's belief about what is right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral, and so forth. So, as questions of fact are dealing with true or false, questions of value are dealing with ethical questions of good or bad, or right or wrong. Now, when you're dealing with a question of value, you really need to justify the clearly defined set of standards that you're going to use. The reason why you need to do this is because different audience members have different values. So you need to find something that you can get your audience to agree with. Just like in questions of fact, speeches on questions of value are usually organized topically because your main points are going to very likely be reasons why you believe your thesis is correct. And as I said before, when you're arguing value, you really need to establish the standard for your value judgment and make sure it's something that the audience can agree with. Now, I use this example because in certain audiences it might be persuasive, and in other audiences maybe not. So if my specific purpose statement is to persuade my audience that capital punishment is legally and morally wrong, the word wrong is the thing that makes this a question of value. So I need to argue that it's legally wrong and that it's morally wrong. Now, it might be easier for our audience, college-educated audience, to argue the first main point than the second main point. So capital punishment violates our constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment might be something that this particular audience would be likely to buy into. The second one, though, some of our audience members may not be particularly religious and may not find this argument that it violates the Bible's commandment, thou shalt not kill, particularly compelling. So obviously you need to know your audience to know if they would buy into such an argument. Maybe you could use a different moral code like the Golden Rule or something of that nature. Finally, questions of policy. Now I have to tell you that most persuasive speeches in public speaking classes tend to be this type. Questions of policy. Now, policy sounds like law or something like that, and in some cases it is, but not necessarily all the time. When we're dealing with questions of policy, what we're dealing with is specific courses of action. So the whole point of a question of policy is that we are arguing whether a particular action should or should not be taken. Now, for questions of policy, there are two types. The first type seeks to gain passive agreement that a policy is desirable, necessary, and practical. Now, you would use passive agreement if the action that you want to happen isn't something that the audience can do. For example, you want a piece of legislation to be enacted. Now, your audience can't make a law, but they can certainly agree with you that a law should be made. The second type seeks to motivate the audience to take immediate action, and you would use this if the thing you want to happen is something that this audience can actually do. So let's look at both of those types. The first one, passive agreement. Your job is to convince the audience that the action you want taken is necessary and desirable, but you really stop short of trying to motivate them to take action. Obviously, if you want Nevada to repeal its motorcycle helmet law, this audience can't repeal a law. The most you can expect the audience to do is agree with you. So we might be convinced that repealing Nevada's motorcycle helmet law would be a good thing to do. So that's passive agreement. Then we have immediate action. Now, in immediate action, you need to convince the audience to actually take some kind of action in support of the policy. In this example, your audience can certainly be encouraged to get out and vote in the next student election. That's an action. So in this case, your job is to give the audience reasons and motivations to actually do this. Now, regardless of whether you're asking for passive agreement or immediate action, there are a couple of things you need to consider in a policy speech. First, you need to show the audience why change is necessary. People don't generally agree to make changes unless you give them good reasons to do that. Then you got to have a plan. You can't just say something needs to be fixed and not give us a way to fix it. You need to show how the problem can best be solved. And it needs to be practical. It needs to be something that's capable of fixing the problem, that is workable, that is doable. This concludes part 2 of chapter 16. Please close this window and move on to part 3.